Welcome to Cornerstone's Walking with God equipping class. I'm Scott, and with me I've got Brian.
Hello.
And Matt.
Hello.
What we're going to be doing in this class is teaching you how to live the basic Christian, well, what we've been doing in all of these classes, and now the final episode of it is teaching you how to live the basic Christian life. And this class is built around the discipleship pathway, as we've been talking about. And this is our last session exploring the calling category, our last session in the Walking in the World class. And we're going to look at, that's right, you've made it. And in this session, we're going to look at the unique roles and responsibilities God has given you in your life. And we've been looking at that in calling. And so let's look back at, over the last sessions, what we've been looking at. Brian, will you kick us off?
Yeah, we talked a bit in the first session about the idea of calling in general, the idea that it is the unique roles and responsibilities that come from God in your life, that there's more than just sort of one calling that you're supposed to accomplish, but it's really these roles and responsibilities that God has placed you around. And we've talked through a few different areas of calling that are really common to people. So we talked about work, the idea that you spend 80% or more of your time and energy doing something in particular in your life, and that is something that isn't just random, but something that God has provided you, at least for today, as a way to love your neighbor as yourself. And then we talked about sort of the callings you find in your household. So how you navigate your family relationships as a role or responsibility that varies amongst people in the family, as well as how you navigate your finances, how you allocate and steward the different things that God has given you to enjoy, but also to share.
Yeah, and then in the last session, we talked about what it means to be called by God as a citizen and a neighbor, that God doesn't place you in this city or in your neighborhood on accident, but that he chose your apartment complex, your street, your neighborhood, your city, so that you as a Christian could represent him there, and that being a citizen of Los Angeles and being a neighbor in your neighborhood is part of God's plan for you as you walk in the world.
So in light of all of that, in light of the fact that we all have these various callings, we've kind of been emphasizing the fact that none of us has this one specific calling, this kind of one calling to rule them all. I think sometimes even the ways that we tend to talk as Christians, but we all have these numerous different callings. And my hope is that this session in particular will be uniquely helpful, because we're going to talk about, in light of all of those different callings, how do we balance them all? How do we figure out how to do all of these really important things? How do we stay faithful to all these really important things when there's not just one of them to focus on? We have all these different callings in each one of our lives. And so here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to look at why we often feel overwhelmed by our callings. We're going to talk about how to realistically pursue faithfulness in all of our different callings. And we're going to look at some practical steps you can take before leaving this class. And so we've talked about a lot of callings, as I mentioned, and we've also talked about a lot of important priorities of the basic Christian life. We've talked about not only do we have all these callings, but we also have Bible, prayer, community, mission. For a lot of people, I think when you think about now at the end of the 12th session of all of these different important things, and maybe they've been doing the Walking with God and Walking in the World classes, the end of the 24th session of all of these really important things, it can be really overwhelming.
That's the kind of thing that you learn, I think, as a pastor, or especially as a preacher. I mean, the three of us do plenty of preaching and teaching, is that there's a way that every time you get up on a Sunday, you say, this is the most important thing that you could ever, and so at some point people start going, wait, are there 52 of these a year? In some ways, that's how this class was born, is trying to categorize the basic Christian life as a way of getting your arms around these different things that are genuinely really important. Is there a way to understand them from a larger perspective? And yet you go through the class and there's a way to feel that way, where everything that we talk about, and maybe the things that you've heard that aren't on this podcast from whatever else you're listening to or whatever other conversations you're having, it feels like everything that comes up is asking for 100% of your time. So Bible's asking for 100% of your time and attention, and prayer is asking for 100% of your time and attention, and work is asking for 100% of your time and attention. And so by the time you're done with even just this class, it's like 600 to 800% of your time is spoken for. Yeah. And we talked about this in the very first introductory session for the Walking with God class, which sort of covers the entirety of this podcast, it's the idea of like the golf swing and how when you learn to, they give you one or two things to focus on when you try and hit a golf ball. And then if you do halfway decent, they give you about 20 more. And it feels like you're supposed to focus 100% of your attention on each one of these 20 pieces of advice. And it makes the whole thing go sideways because you sort of you buckle up. You sort of get all tightened up, and you can't really live or swing the golf club or do anything because you're so stressed out. And so it's easy to get overwhelmed and be really sort of unsure how in the world you're supposed to do all of this stuff in like one life. So how do you take 800% of things that demand 800% of your time and use only 100% of your time to get them done?
Yeah, so I think we can all resonate with that, right? Whether it's the discipleship pathway and specifically whether it's sermons, like you mentioned, I think whenever we think about all the different priorities we have in life, it very naturally feels like it's just too much, right? Like it's almost like God is calling us to do more than we could possibly do. And so what are some of the ways that people typically respond to that feeling? I'm not saying that God actually does call us to more than we can possibly do. We're going to talk about that. But what are ways that people typically respond to that feeling of being, overwhelmed to that kind of smorgasbord of just so many different things we're called to do? How do people tend to handle it?
Yeah, when you think you need to be giving 600%, of your time and energy, I think the initial reaction is that you just sort of freak out all the time. And I mean, when someone asks you to put 6 gallons of water in a 1 gallon jug, it's sort of like, what are you going to do? You freak out. And so you end up getting stressed and kind of like spinning plates in your life. You feel like you're running around trying to keep all the different plates spinning and not falling to the ground. And practically, it ends up being that whatever's sort of most urgent is what you pay attention to. So life is just constantly putting out fires. Whatever the biggest fire is, or like to change the metaphor, it feels like you're in debt on like 8 credit cards. And so your life feels like you're always scrambling to pay off whatever the most recent bill that, came. Like whatever card had the most recent bill, that's the one I'm freaking out about right now. And so there are times then that it either flares up, and so all the things you're supposed to be doing in your life are really present to you and you feel like you're, failing. And other times it's just this low level constant feeling that you're supposed to be doing more. Like whatever you're doing is clearly not enough and you're behind on life. You're sort of failing. That seems to be the initial response that a lot of people have when they see how much there is that life would ask them to do and that, is entailed in the Christian life. And then
after that, sometimes the next experience people have in light of all of that, in light of feeling like you're failing over and over again, there can be a tendency or a natural response to just kind of give up on trying to be faithful in all these areas, to say, man, there's so many things I have to do, and there's no way I could fit that 6 gallons of water into that 1 gallon jug. I'm not even going to pour anything into that jug. And so there's a response that can sometimes happen in light of that leads us to a place of idleness, where we are not working or not working hard or not trying to grow in these areas, not trying to do anything, just trying to blah, and I think we get there at different points when we're feeling that level of overwhelmedness.
Yeah, and I think the other temptation, I think if idleness is one of the temptations, I think one of the other major temptations is idolatry. Like instead of just doing nothing, we kind of sell out in one direction. Right? We're like, okay, I can't do everything, but I'm going to pick one that's the most important, or I'm going to recognize which one seems the most compelling to me, and we make an idol of one of our callings to the neglect of the others. And so maybe it's work. Maybe it's, hey, I've got to do whatever I can do to make my career work. And we go all in that direction to the neglect of our calling for family, or our calling for citizenship, or neighbor, or our calling as neighbor. Or maybe we kind of go all in on our calling for family. And we're like, I put work to the side. I neglect like relationships outside of my family because I'm just focusing on my all I can do is one thing. All I can do is kind of one calling. And I think that when we say, all I can do is one thing, all I can do is one calling, I think that almost it feels like it's justified. It's like, okay, I'm just going to pick one thing and do it. But I think most of the time we recognize that's actually just making an idol of that one calling, because God places us in a city, in a family, in many times a workplace, in a context where we do have various callings, and he's calling us to something beyond just idolizing and focusing on one at a time.
Yeah, and so you end up seeing how easy it is to bounce back and forth between these things, all as a result of that feeling of being overwhelmed. The idea that this is too much, I clearly can't do it, and so I'm either not going to try on anything, or I'm going to pick one thing and completely neglect all the rest and see if I can't sort of get some sense of satisfaction out of that one thing.
So what's the answer then, right? So if we're not supposed to just be idle and be
It's
overwhelmed.
the freak out one. You're supposed to freak out.
Oh, you're supposed to freak out.
Yeah.
You're
The
not
constant
supposed to
feeling
do-
like you're not doing enough.
That's right. That's right. If you, it's not just like do the next thing on your list. If it's not just be idle, if it's not just pick one, then it's just constantly feel a low level of guilt.
Yeah.
That's the holy
Is that
one,
not
right?
it?
Yeah.
Is that, am I wrong?
How do we balance these priorities? How do we live in light of the fact that we've been given various callings?
It's interesting because I think on the one hand, it's appropriate to realize how much there is to be done sort of in the world. We just talked in our last session about, being a good neighbor. It's like, well, there's always in LA going to be more neighbors than you can probably engage with in a meaningful way. There's always more people to be loved. There's always more work to be done. There's an amazing amount of ways that we can engage the different callings God's given us and engage walking with God himself in Bible and prayer and these disciplines.
You'll never exhaust.
Yeah. There's no way that we're ever going to exhaust the amount of ways that we can love God and love our neighbor. And there's a beauty to that. There's an encouragement to that. But a lot of the times we take it as a discouraging thing because we say, well, but we're supposed to be exhausting these things. And yet, the Bible doesn't give us a command to exhaust your love for your neighbor as yourself by loving more than you have the capacity to love. That's not like in the Bible. The Bible gives us a picture of faithfulness, of this idea that in the callings God's given us and the larger understanding of the Christian life as walking with God and walking in the world, there's a way to be faithful in all of these things. And so what God has not put us in a position where he's asking for 600% out of 100%. He's put us in a position where he's orchestrated our life, our callings, our roles and responsibilities, our relationship with him, our relationship with our other Christians in community, with non-Christians in mission, our time to do our own heart work. All these things he's orchestrated in our life in a way that he wants us to be faithful. And so if you look at the notes, there's this graphic, a diagram that we found in a book called The Gospel at Work. It is a calling book, essentially focused on the calling of work. And it shows you this arrow. And on one side of the arrow is faithfulness, and the other side is something they called fruitfulness. And the idea behind fruitfulness was that the Bible gives you a very clear sense of what it looks like to be faithful in your callings. Faithful at work, faithful with your family. And then there's also many ways that are very easy to see that you could produce, in sort of a very biblical word, more fruitfulness. That when you have, you find yourself with extra time, extra mental energy, that you can devote that to producing more fruit in one area of calling or another. And so you have this arrow, and then on the side beneath faithfulness, you see this sort of a drop off into idleness. There's a way that you can be unfaithful in various callings, in work, in family, in your relationship with God, in Bible and prayer. That was you being idle. That's you reacting by not trying. There's also a way of you devoting so much time to bearing fruit in one specific thing that you fall off the other side into idolatry, which is what Scott described earlier. And so when you look at this diagram, you have a decent way of understanding what it means to be faithful in all the different areas of your life. And then also when you see that you have any leftover capacity after you've been faithful to say, well, I now get to wisely choose an area to pursue more fruitfulness. And so when you look at things that way, what you find is you get a really a much less demanding sense of what it means to pursue these different callings, demanding in the negative sense, and a much more beautiful sense of look at all the different ways God has set me up to be faithful, and then look at how many opportunities I might have when I see extra time to be fruitful in these different areas.
Yeah, I mean, even as you're explaining it, like I'm kind of caught up just going through my own life and my own various callings and things like that as I think through it. And what I hear you saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that kind of the first step is to look at all of our various callings and ask, in any of these areas, am I being unfaithful? Mm-hmm. right? Kind of step one is to ask, am I being unfaithful? Because I can pursue increased fruitfulness in all sorts of different areas, but if I'm being unfaithful in others, then right, I'm really just making an idol. All I'm doing is making an idol of that.
It's just
that thing.
disproportionate at that point.
Exactly. And but what I'm called to do is, first of all, look at, is there any way I'm being unfaithful? And then, when I can say like, yeah, I'm generally being faithful, ask, okay, in what areas can I pursue greater faithfulness or fruitfulness? And I mean, you said, this is what you could do with any extra time. I think one of the things that's tough about time is I don't think we ever feel like we have extra of it.
Right. Yeah.
Right. But having extra time or having spare time or kind of sitting around going like, oh, I wonder what I should do right now, which is, I think, for many of us, a foreign experience a lot of the time. But I don't think it necessarily requires that as much as it simply requires just the question of, do I have any additional capacity? And I mean, one of the things I've learned about capacity too is sometimes I only find out what capacity I have by trial and error. Mm-hmm. Right? Sometimes I'm like, oh, maybe I do have a little bit more capacity, and I pursue additional fruitfulness in an area, and I'm like, oh no, I guess I don't. Right? Because pursuing that necessitates. I didn't think it necessitated being unfaithful in these other areas, but maybe as a result it did, and so we rebalance as we go. But we always have to kind of keep an eye on: am I continually being faithful in all these different areas? And then kind of as a secondary question, how can I pursue additional fruitfulness?
Brian, how does this, I think this is so helpful, and I think your clarifications, Scotty, are really helpful as well. How does this relate to like seasonality in life,
Right.
different seasons of life as it pertains to sort of circumstances? How would you answer that question for people, a lot of people who are listening, many of whom are going through different seasons,
Sure.
and their ability to assess or maybe even understand what their capacity is or isn't in different seasons can change over time?
Yeah, I think the best way to picture it in my head is that is almost like a pie chart. Like God has spoken over 100% of your life and your time. Like that's what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. Is that you die to yourself? He's Lord. You're not.
100%.
100%. There's nothing that God does not ask you for, and so it's
There's
not
no
as though
me time.
In a sense, yeah. I mean, there's a sense in which you want to say, yeah, like I'm not. It's not as though I sort of have God and the basic Christian life, 80% of my time, and then I have 20% left over. No, I get to do that what I want. At some level, being a Christian is being a Christian with 100% of your time, and so the way you live, whether it's work or rest or these different things, those are all tied into that 100%. And so the question we're asking is not, well, let me make sure I sort of fill up this and this and this and this. And then with the leftovers, I kind of just see where I want to put them. It's more moving the lines around on the pie chart amongst your different callings, expanding and decreasing things based on your capacity, which I think is a great word Scott used. And that is going to change from season to season. And so there are seasons where certain callings will expand. For example, if someone you love gets really, really sick, the calling to care for them is going to expand in that pie chart. And in a sense, reduce some of maybe the fruitfulness you could have brought out of different areas of calling for that season. If you get sick or you end up starting a new job or you move or all these different things that can change circumstantially.
You have a child.
Exactly. Can create seasons in which one of the callings expands. And the thing to make sure of is that that's not creating unfaithfulness in any other area of your life. Or to possibly at times sort of curate the different things that you have responsibility over to make sure you're not being led into unfaithfulness when you could have avoided it. But the whole idea is that you're balancing these priorities by not giving God some of your time and then with the leftovers seeing if there's any more you could do, but by moving around the different 100% of the different categories in that 100% of your time to allow for faithfulness in all these different areas, and then choosing wisely those that you want to give more of that pie chart to for fruitfulness.
Well, I think you gave some helpful examples there, even just small examples, right, of what that looks like. But it might be helpful if we just kind of tease that out a little bit more. Like, what are some examples, if we were to, what are some examples of how family could expand or decrease depending on season, or how we even should think about what faithfulness looks like and what increased fruitfulness looks like in those areas?
Yeah, I think that you have a pretty clear description of faithfulness with your family in places like, Ephesians 5 and 6. There's a sense of, I'm talking immediate family here, so we'll just kind of make it kind of a nuclear family for the sake of the example. But you have in the marriage sort of godly self-sacrifice, for one another as described in Ephesians 5 and the different roles there. And then raising children sort of in the fear of the Lord, as it's described in Ephesians 6, not provoking them and these different things. The Bible gives you plenty of examples of how to be faithful. If you can say, yes, I am pursuing those things and living those out, then you're being faithful. And you can't not do that. You can never say, oh, well, I'm really busy at work, so I'm not going to raise my kids in the Lord. That's being unfaithful. You've now dropped off into idleness. And there's a sense that you're idolizing your work. So that doesn't work. But at the same time, I think it's really easy to think of ways to bear more fruitfulness. So you can do, long family devotions. You can do, 2 hours of prayer with the with the family. These sort of things that you hear about.
I'm not convinced that would be more fruitful.
Fair enough.
Just to be fair enough, to be honest.
But you get
that might be idolatry.
3 hours of prayer.
7. You get these
Maybe
ideas.
with your kids.
Instagram isn't the first place this happened, where like people you start thinking of other people's lives as being different and better than your own. And there's a Christian version of that, where you hear a story, a very romantic story about someone who did an hour and a half of family devotions, and their family turned out amazing. And there's a way that you now can read that as, well, that must be what faithfulness looks like, and so I'm failing. Like, well, no. Let the Bible determine faithfulness for you. And then if you find you have the capacity for more fruitfulness, say, what'd be pretty cool is starting, lengthening family devotional time. Or maybe it's something else. Maybe it's taking a long trip together. Maybe it's, reading a book together as a family. Every family is different. Mm-hmm. Fruitfulness, the pursuit of fruitfulness can look different. But the truth of the matter is there is a stark difference between being faithful and then pursuing fruitfulness. And you want to make sure that you are being faithful. And then with the extra capacity you have, you're pursuing fruitfulness as wisdom leads you.
And I think there's, I'm sorry, Scotty, but I think there's...
I had a joke, so you should go.
Oh, a joke. Is it a good one?
No.
Because we're all on the edge of our seat now. All right. What was I going to say?
I'm sorry.
I think there's something to be said about kind of like as you assess how things are going in your family too. It's not just based off of like what are the commands of Scripture and am I obeying those commands? It's also like assessing and reflecting on how is like the harmony and joy and like peace of our family. Like how is my marriage? How am I? Are we cultivating love for one another? Are we growing in our love for one another? Is there like thinking about on the edge of faithfulness, right? Like where you say, okay, is my is there family harmony? Is there unity? Is there peace? And is there relational connection? Is there growth happening? And that's different than saying, are we perfectly mature in all these areas and is there no problems at all? It's just kind of reflecting on and assessing, thinking about how the family is doing in a broad sense and asking, are there ways that we can grow and what are ways we can bear more fruitfulness? I think it's helpful to think about that as well as a sort of a baseline biblical principle for faithfulness.
I think it's a great thought. And all my joke was to say that if you already have really long family worship, like additional fruitfulness in your family may not be in like making them longer. Right. Like, and part of that's because I think to your point, oftentimes additional fruitfulness, so sometimes it comes because just in a vacuum, like, I'm just kind of evaluating things and there's more I could do. Oftentimes it's circumstantial as well. Mm-hmm. Like sometimes whether it's a sickness or whether it's a struggle, whether it's a relational problem, like you're like, you know what? My family, like I could be faithful and, kind of love it, but it could, before the Lord, I know it could use more time. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's not even more time. Sometimes it's just more thought.
Intentionality.
Right, exactly. Like I'm just like be more intentional, more purposeful, even with the whatever limited time I have. But so I mean that's one way it could look like in family.
Well, let me add to that before we jump on, because I think the only way you're going to feel freed up to make those decisions is if you understand the difference between having to do absolutely everything conceivably possible to serve and grow your family and faithfulness.
Yeah.
In other words, if you think that in work and family and Bible and prayer that you have to do 100% of everything in order to just be okay, you're never going to have the bandwidth and never going to have the mental capacity to stop and go, well, no, I actually have to not do some things over here to do some things with my family because I'm noticing these different seasons, these different required needs. And that's where I find a lot of people. I find a lot of people in this place where they say, well, I'm just failing at everything, and that actually precludes them from being able to say, I'm looking at my family or I'm looking at something else, and the circumstances tell me that I need to give it more of my attention, more of my time, more of my energy and intentionality, because I'm already failing at too many things. I don't have. You get back to that initial stage, and so I think what's so beautiful about being able to see the difference between the way the Bible describes faithfulness and the way sometimes we heap on all these activities and define them as faithfulness is when you see that difference, you're now freed up to actually have the important questions answered and be able to make the important moves you need to make to be faithful in all the different areas of your calling.
Yeah. I think that's such a great point. And I think that when we think about family, there's also this looks so many different ways.
Yeah.
And there's no two families where it looks similar. And I think, maybe for even the three of us, just in the life stage we're in right now, it looks, we tend to talk about it in a certain way, right? Like
Sure.
with our wives or with our young kids. But like for a single mom, this looks the same. Like it's just simply the question of like, what does faithfulness require for my kids, and how can I be faithful to them with the time that the Lord's given me? Maybe I'm balancing that with also taking care of my aging parent,
Right.
right? While I'm thinking through that, or maybe you are an aging parent, but you have a parent that's even older than you are, or you have adult children that are really struggling, right? And this just ebbs and flows in so many different ways as we seek to fulfill this, that faithfulness doesn't mean doing everything you could possibly do. Faithfulness also doesn't mean doing everything that like the family that sits next to you in the pew on Sunday does. Because their faithfulness and your faithfulness look different. And God's plan for your family, God's plan for your kids, God's plan for your parents isn't contingent upon you fulfilling someone else's faithfulness. God's simply calling you to be faithful with what he's called you to, and he is going to, use that and work through that.
Absolutely.
So, but before we move on, I want to talk about more than just family, even if we do it briefly. I would like to just talk about maybe some examples in the context of work. How could this faithfulness and maybe wrestling with increased fruitfulness look like as we wrestle through it in the context of work?
Yeah, you get verses like 1 Thessalonians 4, 10 through 12. Make it your ambition to live a quiet life. Mind your own business, work with your hands, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders and so that you will not be dependent on anybody. You get other verses like we talked about in Colossians about working as unto the Lord. We talked about that in the session on work. And so there's sort of this idea that being faithful means, providing for yourself and those under your care and having something to share. There's a way in which that as you pursue that pursuit is your pursuit of faithfulness in the calling of work. But then at the same time, you run into the same idea that there are plenty of ways to adjust that around your circumstances, to say like, well, wow, like this thing is happening at work and I really feel like that could use more of my intentionality or attention. Maybe it's a relational thing. Sometimes mission or community and work kind of overlap. And so you have other decisions to make when it comes to these things. And then there's also just the extra ways that you can pursue fruitfulness, so you want to work extra hours, or you want to take on some extra responsibility, or a promotion you'll be good at, or travel for the company, or sign up to do some, mentoring at work. There's all of these different ways you could see producing more fruitfulness at work. And that becomes the question then, is you want to make sure that you're pursuing faithfulness, that you're not looking at some other area of your life and saying, well, I guess I'm just not going to support myself or my family and just stop having anything to share. That's not going to work. And you also don't want to idolize it and say, well, I'm going to do that with something else. So, I'm going to make sure that work is the thing and everything else falls apart. You want to be able to say, how does God want me to devote, this area of my life to him in a way that respects the season he has me in, and in a way that allows me to know that I'm being faithful, even if I might not be doing the exact same thing the guy in the next office is doing. I make sure that I'm being faithful before the Lord.
Yeah, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when we're talking about fruitfulness here, we're essentially talking about like spiritual fruitfulness, like the fruitfulness towards the glory of God.
Yes.
Where like in my job, like yes, there's things I could do to be more fruitful because our culture just loves efficiency, right? And like wants to maximize that completely. And well, that can be a good thing. Like the goal here isn't, okay, how can I be even more efficient to like produce more widgets and, make it sound like it's a question of how, if I'm thinking through this, it's not simply about like maximizing profit, although that's a, part of being a good employee. Really at the core, increased fruitfulness is about maybe working harder unto the Lord, maybe there's ways that the Lord wants to pour your life into your work, or you're even studying for your work, school for a season, right? That's like uniquely intense for the sake of glorifying Him in that. But it's not a one-to-one.
It's not bare efficiency. I mean, I think in one sense, you want to be able to say, like we said during the session, that the job you do in some way contributes to the welfare of your neighbor. And so the idea of producing more of that welfare isn't necessarily a bad, but it's not bare raw efficiency. Like, well, as long as my boss is happy and I'm producing more widgets, then the fruitfulness is more layered than that. I think that's right. And you want to make sure that, like we talked about in the session on work, that when you understand production and productivity, you're doing it with an eye to the ultimate love for neighbor that it allows you to accomplish, not the amount of numbers you can generate or widgets you can produce or things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and there's all sorts of other examples, right? We could look at not just family and work, but we can unpack that. But for the sake of time, I think I want to make sure that we talk about how we actually put this into practice. So, I mean, I think making this a reality in our lives, especially if you've never thought about this, if you've never thought about how do I, or maybe not thought about it lately, like how do I balance appropriately these different callings, and how do I make sure that I'm being faithful in all these different areas, or where can I be more fruitful? It requires some additional work, right? But it also kind of requires regular upkeep. So what are some practical ways we can pursue this type of, I think, appropriate balancing?
So I think you're right. There's kind of a startup cost to this. I think for a lot of people, they do this entirely based on feel, just because whatever's the most urgent thing I'm going to do, or I get tired and I become idle, or we kind of run on the feel of whatever's urgent or whatever feels like it's falling apart, or wherever we're just sort of the most convicted at any given point in time. And so to move in a different direction means to have a sense of what exactly your life entails. Like, in other words, if you can't list out sort of the major callings in your life, it's going to be very hard to know if you're being faithful in those areas. And so what we try and do is track these different things, or maybe a different way to put it is to plan. So you sort of have a sense of where your time and energy and intentionality is going, as well as the different callings that God has, the roles and responsibilities God's put in your life. And then a way of looking forward and saying, well, how do I think faithfulness should look when it comes to these practical, where my time goes and where my finances go and these different things. And so one of the big ones is going to be then keeping a calendar, or at least having some sense. Now, this can look, this can range from a Post-it note to like really extensive software. But the idea of, I know where my time tends to go. So here's my different callings. I've written them down, like we asked you to, I think, in the first session on calling. I know that I need to be in the Bible and praying. There are these things that I know I want to have they're part of that pie chart of my life. And then where is my time actually going, for these things? Some people want to get it down to the 5 minutes. Some people need to know a loose sense, but everyone needs to know something about where your time is going. And then to be able to say, given that, does that look like faithfulness based on what the Bible has to say? And when we look at the season I'm in, and the different circumstances that God's putting in my life, and the capacity that I have, and where do I want the time to go? Do I want that to change? And you want to have that, in that sense, it's a calendar, it's a schedule, and it's you being able to then, next week or next month, look back and say, well, did that happen? Do I feel like I'm actually being faithful in the actual way I'm living out my actual time versus a theoretical way I feel about where my time is going?
That's so helpful and such an important thing because our feel and the reality oftentimes don't match up. And similar to time, we also have a finite amount of resources, right? We're always dividing up our money, giving different amounts to different callings, and you might devote the majority of your money to something like rent and groceries, but you also devote money to socializing and charitable giving. And similar to time, if we never keep track of where our money is going, we're not going to know if we're being faithful. Faithfulness isn't just something based off of feel. It should be based off of actual reflection, actual numbers. There's ways to actually consider and think about not just what's going on, but am I choosing where my time and where my money is going rather than just reacting. So often we just react when we're going based off of feel. Our budgets are based off of feel, or our time is based off of feel. We're just reacting, and we're not choosing where that time should go. So we're not choosing what faithfulness looks like. And so with money, we might feel like we're spending too much on this or spending too little on that, but you actually have some hard numbers if you have a budget and you keep track of your resources, and you'll be surprised how often feelings don't match up to reality. And I think it's really important that we as Christians recognize that because we have limited time, because we have limited resources, we need to be very clear about where that time, where those resources are going, and whether that matches up to our priorities as Christians and the callings that God has given us.
Yeah, I mean, I think of the parable of the talents, right? And Jesus just talks about an owner gave one servant 10 talents, another one 5, and another one 1. And
a talent is a unit of money.
Yes,
just so people don't think about talents as abilities.
Exactly. But when he came back, to the one with 10 talents, he says, "Oh, here's your 10, and I made you 10 more." Right? He didn't say, "Oh, you gave me 10? I don't know how. I actually don't even know how many you gave me." Right? And I made you some more, but I don't know how many, or I don't know how. There's just a very basic understanding that I gave you, entrusted you with something, and I've entrusted you with time. I've entrusted you with resources. I've entrusted you with the ability to fulfill these callings.
And it was 10, not 30, and not 100, right?
Exactly.
It could have been more.
It could have been more, and for different people, it was more and less. Yeah, exactly. And thinking that they'd been given what the other person was given would have been a mistake as well. They had to kind of know very tangibly, what have I been given, and then what did I do with it? I think to make that a reality in our lives, I think you're both exactly right. I think we need to kind of track and plan both our finances and our time and the stewardship of what God has entrusted to us. And I think to make that happen, and not to get kind of too out there, but I think we also need to track and plan our tracking and planning.
Meta.
That's right. And the reason is because essentially we need to take time out to do that type of tracking and planning. And the reason is because, like we talked about before, seasons change. You can't just do this once and then it never changes for all of life. You can't just ride out the allocation of your time that you determined during this season in your life.
When you were single versus when you have 3 kids and you have a job. And
exactly. You've constantly got to be, and seasons change. I mean, not only in years and decades, they can change over the course of months, where the dynamics change, and we need to think through these things again. And so I think one of the things I've found most helpful is to carve out time simply to think about these things. Right? Plan to plan. I need to put on my calendar, this is the time I'm going to sit back and pray through, think through, seek God through how I should allocate life during this season, and constantly take time to kind of step back and reassess.
Scott, do you have any words, just any words for those who are a little bit more fly by the seat of your pants kind of people? Because some of this, there's a personality.
Yeah, totally.
I think there's a mentality that this is something that is reduced to a person with a particular personality like you that might have every 5 to 7 minutes of your life on a calendar and all that. There's a mentality, right, that some people do this and then other people just kind of wing it. Totally. And that's, what do you say to the wing it people?
be more like me.
Interesting person to ask that question.
Moving on.
I don't have anything else. No. I think it's a great question because I think the differences in our personalities, the differences in our preferences, even just the differences in our experiences, or the differences in our callings. I mean, and the dynamics of those don't change whether or not we need to think through these things, but they will change how we think through them. And so I think, the way I do it is a product of both, the way my own mind works and my own experience and things like that. And so it looks a certain way. And the way, just like a lot of other things, like the way other people plan, the way other people track their time or track their finances, like you don't have to be able to, pull up a Excel spreadsheet and tell me what you spent on groceries in July of 2003, even though I can do that. That doesn't have to be normal. It isn't like for everybody, but you do need to think critically about your finances and have an idea of what God has entrusted you with and what you are doing with it. And so I think it's actually appropriate. I think it's probably actually really faithful for a lot of people to fly by the seat of their pants more than I do. Like, I think it's totally faithful. And maybe there's something I should learn from them as well. And sometimes I'm like, there's ways I should do more of that as well.
Maybe there's something to learn.
I'll think about it during my planning time. But the reality is that there's not, we are still called to be stewards of our time and our finances. And so it doesn't matter how you do it. It doesn't matter even how like specific or detailed necessarily you get. But the thing I would say is that you need to, I think we are all called to think deeply, critically, and prayerfully about how we're spending our time and money before the Lord. And I think as we do that, whatever that looks like, I think for some people that'll look like sitting in front of a spreadsheet in an office. I think for other people that'll look like a hike and like sitting on top of a mountain and maybe fasting for like a half a day and thinking through, Lord, like what does this look like and how can I continue to be increasingly faithful? And so I think there's also a lot that we can learn from one another as we grow in that. But it's not about the how, but it's about the fact that we all are called. In order to be faithful in this, we need to know what God's entrusted to us and think deeply, critically, and prayerfully about how He's calling us to use it in every different season as those seasons continue to shift.
Because ultimately what we're talking about is love. I think that's kind of sometimes we start talking about numbers and spreadsheets, we lose sight of that. And we think that, this is for people who like that sort of a thing. Yeah. But at some point where, if you feel like you gave your neighbor who's hungry a lot of food, but you really didn't, like you didn't love them very well. Exactly. And it's not about temperament. It's about whether or not you're caring for that person. And we're talking about loving God with heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving our neighbor as ourselves. And so when we start talking about the pie chart of the basic Christian life and our callings, even calling it a pie chart might sound a little too mathematical for people. The point is not how you envision it. The point is if you're actually loving God and loving your neighbor. And we have to know that. We can't just avoid thinking about that and assume we're doing it, because these are the important things for which God placed us on the earth. And so with that in mind, I think we talk about balancing priorities. We're not talking about like staying safe and making sure like you're doing things the right way. We're talking about making sure that you're living out your purpose for which you're designed, to love God and love your neighbor as yourself in all these different ways, and trusting that God has given you enough time and resources, and He's given us different amounts and different resources in some ways, that He's given us enough for us to be faithful in the callings that He's given us.
I'm hosting this, not you.
Yes.
So I will wrap this up. We've been talking about walking in the world, spreading, displaying God's glory in our lives, and that means being faithful in all of the different parts of the Christian life. And so here's what we've talked about in this session. We've talked about why we often feel overwhelmed by our callings. We've talked about how to realistically pursue faithfulness in all of our different callings, as well as increased fruitfulness. And we've talked about some practical steps that you can take leaving this class as you think through how you steward both all of your various callings and all of what it means to walk with God and walk in the world. And so here are some final practical questions we want to leave you as we leave with you as we leave this session and as we wrap up the entire class. First of all, as this class ends, where are your next steps in community, mission, and calling? And you're not what is everything you could possibly do, but what's your next step in each one of these areas? How can you keep from losing focus on these parts of the Christian life? And we would really strongly encourage you to carve out some time, to just take some time, and whether it's time to plan or time to pray, just simply time to think and pray. Just carve out time to think and pray about your callings, identify what faithfulness looks like according to Scripture, and then evaluate your faithfulness. Ask if there's any room left, maybe even any room that you didn't realize was there to pursue more fruitfulness in some of those areas, particularly during this season. And we are so glad that we got to spend this time with you. You got to spend this time with us. We look forward to discussing these things in the class, and thank you for the commitment you've made to walk with us as we've talked through how we all are called to walk in the world and with God. Thanks.